And good evening and welcome to a special edition of Hannity's America, Obama and Friends, the history of radicalism. Now tonight, we are bringing you an entire hour of Barack Obama's questionable relationships. Now we'll have exclusive information never revealed before about his ties to controversial people and radical groups. Now first on the rundown, Barack Obama and his mysterious college years.
Barack Obama is said to be a great speaker.
Tonight I speak to you not as a candidate for president.
A politician with impressive oratory skills.
And that's what I intend to do.
But there's one thing the articulate and well-spoken presidential candidate is mum about, and that's his college years. Now we know he spent 2 years studying in California at Occidental College, about which he told Newsweek magazine, quote, "The 2 years I spent there were a dead end." Then he moved on to New York and Columbia University, and that's where the roadblock begins. It seems he's gone to great lengths to keep his college years a secret. One of the few details that Obama mentions about his time in New York is his roommate, a Pakistani he calls Sadiq in his book.
He was dabbling in cocaine at the time he was living with Obama. Siddiqui maintains that they did not do drugs together.
Obama has admitted that he, too, dabbled in drugs.
I spent the last 2 years of high school in a daze, drank beer heavily, and tried drugs enthusiastically.
But he says he stopped shortly after his father's death. Now, Fox News tracked down Sadiq, whose real name turned out to be Sehol Siddiqui, but he refused to talk to us. David Bossie of Citizens United believes that when it comes to answering questions involving his controversial past, for Obama, it's business as usual.
Barack Obama definitely has something to hide.
Many believe it was during these formative college years that his radical beliefs and relationships began.
Barack Obama and Barack Obama's campaign will not release any information on his time at Columbia or Harvard, and will not allow Columbia or Harvard to release any information. So we're really dealing with, with very limited information.
Even the Obama-friendly New York Times has reported that, quote, Obama declined repeated requests to talk about his New York years, release his Columbia transcript, or identify even a single fellow student, co-worker, roommate, or friend from those years. One of the most sought-after pieces from Obama's college past is his senior thesis. Try and find that, and you'll come up with the same thing. Nothing.
No one has found a copy of. We have not been able to uncover it, and we've actually put ads in newspapers trying to find it.
So why wouldn't Obama want us to see his thesis?
The title of his senior thesis was Soviet Nuclear Disarmament in 1983, at the height of the Cold War. At the time, the very time President Reagan was putting forth policies of peace through strength. What did Barack Obama believe? And this comes at the same time where he says he would sit down unconditionally with North Korea, with Iran.
The notion that somehow not talking to countries is punishment to them, which has been the guiding diplomatic principle of this administration, is ridiculous.
So what is Obama trying to hide? Is he afraid his Columbia transcript and his senior thesis will reveal average grades, or is he trying to hide a blossoming radical philosophy? And what about his time at Harvard? We know that Obama became president of the Harvard Law Review, but we know very little else about his time at the prestigious law school.
We don't have a copy of anything at the Harvard Law Review with Barack Obama's name on it.
And how did he get into the ultra-exclusive Harvard Law School anyway? Percy Sutton, who's a former borough president of Manhattan and a former lawyer for Malcolm X, may have inadvertently given us the answer. In an interview with a local New York City news station, Sutton said that a known radical extremist with ties to the Saudi government personally asked him to help Obama get into Harvard.
I was introduced to him by a friend who's raising money for him. The friend's name is Dr. Khalid Al-Mansour.
This explosive interview and piece of evidence appears to connect Barack Obama to Dr. Khalid Al-Mansour, a top advisor to a key Saudi Arabian official and a former mentor to the Black Panther Party. Al-Mansour is a name that most Americans are not familiar with, but he is a familiar figure in African-American communities here in the United States and Muslim communities around the world. Al-Mansour is an author, a lawyer, a Saudi advisor, an Orthodox Muslim, a black nationalist, and an outspoken enemy of the State of Israel. Take a listen to his views on Jewish people.
But the white Jews took over Judaism, and they are the ones who are saying, we want Jerusalem. We want Samaria. We want the Arab land. And they say, when you ask them, why do you want them? They say, God gave it to us. That's a lie.
And listen to what he says about white America.
So white people don't feel bad. Whatever you do to them, they deserve it. God wants you to do it. And that's whether you cut off the nose, cut off the ears, take flesh out of their body. Don't worry. God wants you to do that.
That sounds like some of Obama's other friends.
Oh, I am so glad that I got a God who knows what it is to be a poor black man in a country and a culture that is controlled by and run by rich white people.
Before entering Harvard, Obama worked briefly as a community organizer for the Chicago-based Gamaliel Foundation, which is founded on the principles of the radical socialist Saul Alinsky, considered by many to be the godfather of community organizing.
Tell us about, for example, the relationship as it relates to the belief system of Saul Alinsky.
Saul Alinsky is a very central figure in Barack Obama's life precisely because of his time as a community organizer in Chicago. The community organizing he's involved in, a lot of people hear that community organizer. They get a very different picture from what this is. If you read Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and Reveille for Radicals, what you find is a philosophy that's very calculating. How can I manipulate people into following a certain course of action that I want them to take? That is his, that's the underlying philosophy here.
This is a formative time in his life. He refuses to answer any questions. His campaign refuses to answer any questions. And the American people have the right, and we must demand to know why he did that. What influences? Was it Saul Alinsky? Was it any other socialist? We know he went to socialist speeches and activities. What were his activities? Who was he associating himself with, and what was he listening to? What were his influences? So those are the questions we need to know before we make an educated decision in November.
Obama's reluctance to talk about, quote, the college years adds to the growing suspicions of many that the Illinois senator has a background in radicalism that he'd rather not talk about.
Keep moving.
And coming up next, Barack Obama, the community organizer. Now, was this the beginning of a grand scheme perpetuated by radicals? You'll be hearing from a man who says it is. And then the senator is trying to hide his ties to Weather Underground leader William Ayers, but we'll expose the truth behind his relationship with the admitted unrepentant terrorist. Coming up. Much has been made of Senator Obama's community organizing days. Now, he says it was a life-altering experience that prepared him to lead America. But our next guest reveals the background story of how community organizing is part of a grand scheme perpetuated by none other than William Ayers.
A lot of people don't know what a community organizer is, and in fact, I didn't know what a community organizer was entirely when I became one. I had been inspired by the civil rights movement and the idea of people working at a grassroots level to bring about change, to get people involved in shaping their own destiny.
Well, community organizing definitely has shaped Senator Obama's destiny. In 1985, fresh from Columbia University, Obama returned to Chicago to become just that, a community organizer, a job he says qualifies him in part to hold the nation's highest office. But what exactly is a community organizer? After all, he didn't even know what it was when he started as one.
I think a community organizer in Barack Obama's case was somebody that was in training for radical overthrow of the government. You have to really stretch to believe his story. That he was living in New York City. He was earning $50,000 or $60,000 a year. And he left this to come to Chicago, to a city where he knew no one, to suddenly start, quote, organizing, unquote, people. In my opinion, Barack Obama had already been influenced by his radical ideology and philosophy, probably had met William Ayers in New York, and was coming here to lay the foundations for what he thought would be some sort of political movement that he would be a part of. My view is that the community organizing was actually kind of a sham event, that really Bill Ayers was testing him. Because the way these radicals work, they don't give you a big project until you've passed muster with a small project. And so they sent him out to Chicago to see what he would do. He passed the test.
I decided to become a community organizer. I'll organize black folks at the grassroots. It was in these neighborhoods that I received the best education that I ever had.
He had virtually no impact in his so-called community organizing career except to lay the foundation for his future radical associations. It was then also, I believe, that he was exposed, perhaps by Louis Farrakhan, to Khalid al-Mansour, because it's while he's a community organizer that Khalid al-Mansour starts raising money to promote Obama to Harvard Law School. So obviously, in Ayers' mind and al-Mansour's mind, Obama had proven his reliability. He was somebody that could be trusted to do what he was told, and all of a sudden, they now are going to take him to the next level. All that comes out of the years in Chicago. Obama wasn't organizing a community. He was organizing his career and organizing his life step to the next level. That's all he did in Chicago.
This is the elite Kenwood community here in Chicago, and I'm actually walking down Barack Obama's street. You can see behind me Secret Service and police officers are blocking it off so we can't get too close. Back in 2005, Barack Obama purchased the house for $1.65 million. It was a controversial deal. Coincidentally, he bought it the same day that the Rezko family purchased the land next door. And it just so happens they live half a mile from William Ayers, the unrepentant terrorist part of the Weather Underground. And this is it. Would he be interested in interviewing with us? And just down the street from those homes is the house of Louis Farrakhan, the leader of the Nation of Islam. There have been numerous reports linking Senator Barack Obama with Farrakhan and the people of his church.
You know, there's a model for all this, and the model is Hugo Chavez. Bill Ayers has been to Venezuela and admires Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan dictator. Chavez, in turn, learned from Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. So if you love the Cuban Revolution and Castro, and if you love what's happening in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, you'll love Barry Obama, Barack Obama, as he calls himself, in the White House. We're basically going to be in the throes of a socialist revolution, which attempts to essentially freeze out anybody who's not part of this radical ideology.
And coming up next, we take a look at Obama's relationship with an admitted and unrepentant terrorist, William Ayers, and will prove to you that this relationship was more than just, quote, friendly. Then he was Barack Obama's pastor for more than 20 years and plagued his political campaign. Coming up later, we look into the Illinois senator's controversial association with the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Straight ahead. And welcome back to the special edition of Hannity's America. We now turn to admitted and unrepentant terrorist William Ayers and the relationship with him that Obama continues to try and downplay.
In the 1970s, a notorious organization called the Weather Underground was one of America's most radical groups of terrorists. Led by William Ayers, the Weather Underground was a violent anti-American group that was formed on the campus of the University of Michigan during the midst of the anti-war and civil rights movements. In 1970, they issued a declaration of a state of war against the United States government. Members adopted different identities and plotted acts of terror that included the bombing of the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, New York City Police Headquarters, military recruitment centers, and several other government buildings. Eventually, they landed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. While the group's main targets were the government establishments, one night in 1970, they made one very personal attack. It was on February 21st when William Ayers and the Weathermen went after John Murtaugh and his entire family. Murtaugh was presiding over the trial of another group of terrorists, 21 members of the Black Panther Party, who were indicted in a plot to bomb New York landmarks and department stores.
February 21st, 1970. I had just turned 9 about 2 months earlier. It was pre-trial, jury selection. About 2 o'clock in the morning, our entire family, 4 of us, actually 5 of us, my sister, my brother, my parents, were awakened to 3 firebombs, carefully placed, 2 at the front entrance of the house, 1 by the back door underneath the tank of the family car.
And by the way, the morning after, when the sunlight comes out, 3 sentences are revealed, blood-red graffiti on the sidewalk, "Free the Panther 21, the Viet Cong have won, and kill the pigs."
That's right. And it's also important to remember, Sean, that we were one of 3 sites bombed that night around New York City. It wasn't just our house.
Yeah, no one ever caught or was tried for the attempt on your family's life here, because the one underneath the car literally was under the gas tank, right?
That's right. That's right. And thank God a neighbor actually managed to put that out before it actually exploded.
The Murtaugh family survived, but the Weathermen weren't finished yet. That same night, bombs were thrown at a police car in Manhattan and 2 military recruiting stations in Brooklyn, New York. Over the years, many members would turn and leave the group. The remaining fugitives operated underground. While on the run, William Ayers married fellow Weatherman terrorist Bernadine Dorn. In 1981, the two finally turned themselves in and were tried but not convicted because of prosecutorial misconduct. After the trial, Ayers and his wife tried to integrate back into society, and he went back to school, began teaching, and was also, quote, a community leader. It was his position as a, quote, community leader that would lead Ayers and Barack Obama to cross paths. It was in 1995 that Ayers and his wife hosted a political coming-out party at their Chicago home for a young Barack Obama. As you can now imagine, though, Obama is now downplaying his association with his radical friends. The Obama campaign describes the relationship between Obama and Ayers as quote-unquote friendly, but Hannity's America has discovered much more. Besides the coming-out party in 1995, Senator Barack Obama also served as a director for the nonprofit Woods Fund of Chicago from 1999 to 2002, alongside his friend William Ayers. In addition, both Ayers and Obama have also appeared together at various public speaking engagements. In 2002, they spoke together at a forum in Chicago, sponsored in part by the University of Illinois, titled Intellectuals, Who Needs Them? Obama and Ayers were on a panel of just 6 people. It would seem that they are a little bit more than just, quote, friendly, but Obama continues to hedge and weave over this relationship. In April, during a primary debate, George Stephanopoulos asked Senator Obama about these ties.
Can you explain that relationship for the voters and explain to Democrats why it won't be a problem?
George, but this is an example of what I'm talking about. This is a guy who lives in my neighborhood, who's a professor of English in Chicago, who I know and who I have not received some official endorsement from. He's not somebody who I exchange ideas from on a regular basis. And the notion that somehow, as a consequence of me knowing somebody who engaged in detestable acts 40 years ago when I was 8 years old, somehow reflects on me and my values doesn't make much sense, George.
But as Obama tries to downplay their relationship and distance himself from the unrepentant terrorists, we cannot forget this past that he's trying to bury. We also must remember that Obama and Ayers do have a history together, and Ayers still refuses to apologize for his horrific acts of terror. In fact, of all days, September 11, 2001, the very day the United States was attacked by Muslim extremists, Ayers told the New York Times, quote, "I don't regret setting bombs. I feel we didn't do enough," unquote. When asked if he would do it all over again, he said, quote, I don't want to discount the possibility. So it looks like we just have another case of Obama and his radical friends and their history of radicalism.
And joining us now is Larry Krathwohl. Larry, welcome to Hannity's America. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
A phenomenal story. For a year, you infiltrated the Weather Underground. You know and knew personally Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers. You began working for the FBI. You even moved into the home of the Weather Underground, right? And that included Bill Ayers. You lived with him.
Yes, I did.
For a year. Tell us about that time.
Well, I was, after the group went underground in December 1969, I was assigned to various cells in Detroit, Michigan, Madison, Wisconsin, Buffalo, New York. During those periods, I lived with various members of the group in which Bill was the leader and would either stay with us or leave and come back and take charge of the group.
Now, you were there with Bill Ayers and sat at a kitchen table, and he specifically not only taught you how to build a bomb, but actually drew pictures of it and actually told you what cities to target, correct?
Yes, when we were in Detroit, 2 targets were picked out, the Detroit Police Officers Association building in the 13th precinct. There was some kind of a trial going on involving police officers. And he told us what buildings we should bomb. He assigned the people to the various locations. And when I objected, because the DPOA building was next door to a restaurant, and then it was my belief that the bomb would kill more people in the restaurant than anyone in this old brownstone building in Detroit, he told me that in a revolution, innocent people have to die.
We really appreciate you being with us on Hannity's America. Thank you, sir. And coming up, he sat in the pews of Jeremiah Wright's church for over 20 years. But how close was Senator Obama to his former pastor? We examine their relationship coming up next. And then this man is a former employee of the Palestinian Liberation Organization who openly speaks about the destruction of Israel. We're going to tell you about his connection to Obama. That's coming up straight ahead on this special edition of Hannity's America. Back to the special edition of Hannity's America, Obama and Friends, the history of radicalism, the outrageous sermons preached by the Reverend Jeremiah Wright and Father Michael Pfleger sent shockwaves throughout the country. Now tonight we examine just how close Senator Obama is to these controversial leaders.
His controversial associations have plagued his political campaign, but there was one that almost brought his White House hopes to a halt. It was his relationship with his pastor of more than 20 years, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Barack Obama first met Wright in the late 1980s when he was a community organizer in Chicago. While sitting in the pews for over 2 decades, Barack Obama was heavily influenced by the radical pastor. His second book, The Audacity of Hope, was even inspired by one of Wright's teachings. His admiration was so deep that Obama quoted one of Wright's sermons in his first book.
Where white folks' greed runs a world in need, apartheid in one hemisphere, apathy in another hemisphere.
Reverend Wright preaches an Afrocentric theology, a belief system based on the writings of James Cone. He wrote of, quote, a theology whose sole purpose is to apply the freeing power of the gospel to black people under white oppression, unquote. Cone also claims that, quote, white racism is a disease. No excuse can be made for it. We blacks can only oppose it with every ounce of humanity. Liberation theology is a Christian school of thought that began in the 1960s in Latin America. It sees Jesus not just as a redeemer, but as a liberator of the oppressed. It's often cited as being a form of, quote, Christian socialism, since it mixes politics and religion.
Our congregation stood in solidarity with the peasants in El Salvador and Nicaragua, while our government, through Ali North and the Iran-Contra scandal, was supporting the Contras.
Jose Diaz-Balart from the Telemundo Network was stationed in El Salvador and Nicaragua as a war correspondent at the time.
Liberation theology in Nicaragua in the mid-'80s was a pro-Sandinista, pro-Marxist, anti-U.S., anti-Catholic Church movement. I saw the churches in Nicaragua that he spoke of, and the churches were churches that talked about the need for violent revolution. Jesus Christ on the altar was not Jesus Christ. He was a Sandinista soldier.
This is who Reverend Wright was supporting? Hannity and Combs was the first to expose Reverend Wright and his controversial teachings.
Now, Reverend, if every time we said black, if it was a church, and those words were white, wouldn't we call that church racist?
No, we would call it Christianity. We've been saying that since there was a white Christianity. We've been saying that ever since white Christians took part in the slave trade. We've been saying that ever since they had churches in slave castles. We don't have to say the word white. We just have to live in white America, United States of white America.
And about a year later, the media began to catch up and the tapes emerged.
God bless America? No, no, no. Not God bless America. God damn America.
Senator Obama was in a bind. Does he defend his pastor and spiritual mentor of more than 20 years, or does he denounce him?
As imperfect as he may be, he has been like family to me.
One of my members just might turn this mother out, turn the tables on white supremacy, and have a black woman sleeping legally at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
He strengthened my faith, officiated my wedding, and baptized my children.
And they will not only attack you if you try to point out what's going on in white America, US of KKKA.
I can no more disown him than I can disown the black community. I can no more disown him than I can disown my white grandmother.
But Senator Obama's half-hearted attempt to ease the minds and hearts of Americans would not work. After keeping quiet for several weeks, Jeremiah Wright emerged at an NAACP event in Detroit and added more fuel to the fire.
Arabic is a language, it's not a religion. Barack Hussein Obama, Barack Hussein Obama, Barack Hussein Obama.
But he didn't stop there. The following day, Jeremiah Wright raised even more eyebrows when he spoke before the National Press Club.
You cannot do terrorism on other people and expect it never to come back on you. This is not an attack on Jeremiah Wright. It has nothing to do with Senator Obama. It is an attack on the black church.
Finally, after all the outrageous comments, the Obama campaign could handle no more.
Michelle and I told Reverend Otis Moss that we were withdrawing as members of Trinity.
But what took him so long? He distanced himself from Jeremiah Wright, but this was not the only religious leader that Obama would have to run away from. At the same time that Reverend Wright's explosive comments were playing around the country, Father Michael Pfleger emerged onto the scene. Father Pfleger, a Catholic priest, is also a community organizer and activist in Chicago. He made headlines back in May when he gave this racially charged sermon at Trinity United Church of Christ.
When Hillary was crying, and people said that was put on, I really don't believe it was put on. I really believe that she just always thought, this is mine. And then out of nowhere came, hey, I'm Barack Obama. And she said, oh, damn, where did you come from? I'm white. I'm entitled. There's a black man stealing my show.
Father Pfleger, like Reverend Wright, is a close associate with the Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. Father Pfleger has even called Farrakhan, quote, a gift from God to a sick, sick world and one of the most prophetic voices of our times. So how can they honor and praise a man who once said white men were the skunk of the planet Earth?
And I'll be damned if I'm going to sit back while you tear down Farrakhan and Jeremiah Wright. How dare you!
But just how close are Father Pfleger and Barack Obama? Well, back in 1999, Pfleger supported Obama during his run for the state Senate. The records also show that Pfleger contributed thousands of dollars to his campaign. Obama also steered a $100,000 state grant into Pfleger's affiliated programs back in 2000. And if that's not enough proof, Father Pfleger was once a member of the, quote, Catholics for Obama committee. It seems Barack Obama thought it was acceptable to be associated with Wright and Pfleger when it was political convenience, but discarded them when they turned into a political liability. Unfortunately for Obama, the truth has been revealed and the American people know who his real friends now are.
And still a lot more to come on this special edition of Hannity's America. Up next, Barack Obama has had some trouble with Jewish voters for his stance on Israel, but his connection to a man who has ties to a former terrorist organization may only make it worse. We'll give you all the details coming up next as Hannity's America continues.
In today's luxury game, the question isn't whether or not your car has available features like a 40-gig hard drive.
Barack Obama's stance on Israel caused major problems for him among some Jewish voters, and their concern with the presidential hopeful doesn't come as a surprise, considering his relationship with a man who has ties to the former terrorist organization, the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Senator Barack Obama, with his occasional American flag pin on his lapel, spoke in front of Jewish voters at a synagogue in Florida. He wanted to reassure them of his personal commitment to Israel, but his loyalty was quickly called into question.
You also characterized that you and your wife's personal relationship with Rashid Khalidi, an avowed anti-Israel scholar at Columbia.
You mentioned Rashid Khalidi, who's a professor at Columbia. I do know him because he taught at the University of Chicago, and he is Palestinian. And I do know him, and I have had conversations. He is not one of my advisors. He's not one of my foreign policy people. His kids went to the lab school, where my kids go as well. He is a respected scholar, although he vehemently disagrees with a lot of Israel policy.
As another radical relationship comes to light, Senator Obama is minimizing his association with Rashid Khalidi, an allegedly former member of a terror organization.
Rashid Khalidi today is a professor at Columbia, earlier was professor at the University of Chicago, but before that he was an employee of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And he was an employee of the PLO back when it was a designated terrorist organization. In 1982, the New York Times referred to him in an article on June 9th of that year as director of the Palestinian news press agency. And other references subsequent suggest that he was an employee of the PLO at a time when the PLO was, as I say, a designated terrorist organization by the U.S. government.
Today, Rashid Khalidi is the head of the Middle East program at Columbia University. Not surprisingly, he helped coordinate Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's speech at the school, who said Israel should be wiped off the map. The Palestinian activist is an outspoken critic of the United States who mourns the establishment of Israel as a, quote, catastrophe.
He has justified terrorism by Palestinians against Israeli soldiers in the West Bank on the grounds that what he called resistance to occupation is legitimate in international law, unquote. In other words, terrorism okay if it's against soldiers.
Daniel Pipe says a financial web connects Senator Obama to the former PLO agent.
It's also clear from the record that they had a financial connection and that Obama sat on the board of a foundation, the Wood Fund, that gave money in 2 successive years, 2001, 2002, to an organization, the Arab American Action Network, that Rashid Khalidi co-founded and his wife directed. And the other direction, Khalidi held a fundraiser, a political fundraiser for Barack Obama in 2000. So they were helping each other financially.
The foundation that Pipes referred to is the Chicago-based Woods Fund that both Obama and the unrepentant terrorist William Ayers co-chaired. Incidentally, Khalidi thanks Ayers in his book, Resurrecting Empire, saying that Bill was particularly generous in letting me use his family's dining room table to do some of the writing for the project. Ayers and Obama reportedly approved $70,000 to Khalidi's Arab organization.
I think the financial relationship between Khalidi and Obama is important because it points to their relationship not just being social, intellectual, but having a deeper base, that they are people who are working together towards the same end.
In 2003, Barack Obama held a lavish farewell dinner for Khalidi before he left for Columbia University. The Los Angeles Times reported on the event in April of this year. The headline, "Allies of Palestinians see a friend in Obama." Here's what the paper said, quote, "A special tribute came from Khalidi's friend and frequent dinner companion, the young state senator Barack Obama." Speaking to the crowd, Obama reminisced about meals prepared by Khalidi's wife, Mona, and conversations that had challenged his thinking. That night, Obama said his conversations with the Khalidis served as, quote, consistent reminders to me of my own blind spots and my own biases. It is for that reason that I'm hoping that for many years to come, we continue that conversation, a conversation that is necessary not just around Mona and Rashid's dinner table, but around the entire world, unquote. The Nation magazine published an opinion piece by Khalidi titled Palestine, Liberation Deferred. The piece opens with Khalidi characterizing the Palestinian question as a, quote, running sore. 5 days after, in the Atlantic magazine, Senator Obama responded in a similar manner, saying, quote, this constant sore does infect all of our foreign policy. Coincidence? Or is Khalidi influencing Obama's Middle East talking points? Khalidi went on to suggest in his piece that Israel carried out ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. Hannity's America reached out to both Rashid Khalidi and Barack Obama. Both declined our request for comments.
But as Barack Obama continues to grapple with his foreign policy vision, Jewish voters like the gentleman you heard from earlier are clearly concerned about the presidential candidate, as well they should be. After all, Obama's relationships with these types of people has even brought in support from terrorist organizations like Hamas. Hamas is an outspoken enemy of Israel's and has been very vocal about seeing Israel come to an end. In an interview earlier this year, Ahmed Youssef, chief political advisor to the prime minister of Hamas, said, quote, we like Mr. Obama, and we hope that he'll win the election. Why? He has a vision to change America. But if Obama has a vision to change America the way Hamas thinks is good, we all have something to worry about. And coming up, Barack Obama's earliest work experience was with an organization considered to be the largest radical group in America. We'll tell you who they are and what he did for them coming up right after the break.
Primetime Monday, the rescue plan. Congress is bailing out banks and saving businesses. But what's in this bill for you? Neil looks at how the big bailout affects your money, only on Your World.
Mr. Clean tackles messes two ways with the power of Mr. Clean plus the freshness of Febreze. Mr. Clean's right at home with the tough stuff. What gets tracked in, what gets stained on, even baked on. The magical cleaning power wipes dirt out, and the Febreze freshness draws people in. The toughness of Mr. Clean, the freshness of Febreze. In pourable liquid and spray, they've teamed up to tackle tough cleaning.
Presenting the Travelocity Race to Savings sale. Save up to 50% on vacations to our top hotels. But hurry, because like the Amazing Race, you gotta be fast.
In 2 days, be the first to experience Walt Disney's ultimate fairy tale, Sleeping Beauty. See more movie than ever before in an expanded version, now digitally restored. New on Platinum DVD and Blu-ray this Tuesday for a limited time.
An important announcement for dialysis patients who are given a contrast dye during an MRI or MRA. You may be at risk of the incurable disease nephrogenic systemic fibrosis or NSF. Symptoms of NSF include stiffening of the skin, dark skin patches starting at the ankles, and joint stiffness. If you have any of these symptoms, you may have a valuable legal claim. Time to pursue a claim.
As we all know, Barack Obama is very proud of his background as a community organizer in Chicago. Tonight, Hannity's America takes a deeper look at an organization that he had and has very close ties to, a highly controversial group called Acorn.
Democratic presidential nominee Barack Obama says his experience as a Chicago community organizer shaped his political views and helped prepare him for the highest office in the land. But as much as he wants to inflate the importance of his neighborhood experience, he barely mentioned one of the groups that he worked most closely with during that time, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, otherwise known as ACORN. ACORN is a grassroots organization considered by some to be the largest radical group in America. Under the guise of helping low-income families and neighborhoods, ACORN uses shady tactics and intimidation to get what they want. Right now, this ultra-liberal political machine is under investigation on charges of voter fraud.
Acorn employees have been implicated in vote fraud investigations in several states. In Wisconsin, 37 of their employees have been investigated. One, I believe, was indicted this week. In Texas, 2 out of every 5 of their voter registrations in Houston are suspect, may not be valid. In North Carolina, they registered a 14-year-old boy. In Pennsylvania, a former Acorn employee has been indicted for perjury and identity theft.
And that's just the beginning. This shady organization has been involved in voter fraud schemes all over the country for years.
Last year, the prosecutors in Seattle, Washington said that Acorn was at the center of the biggest voter registration fraud in the state's history. People had gone to the county library, they had taken phone books, and they had filled out voter registration cards. Of 1,800 cards they submitted, only six were valid.
But Acorn's dirty dealings go beyond just voter fraud. Back in the 1990s, they used strong-arm tactics to force banks to give high-risk loans to low-income borrowers with bad credit.
Acorn uses militant tactics. They call it direct action. Sometimes Acorn will actually send people to a bank official's home. They'll scare him, they'll scare his kids. Again, all in an effort to get the banks to make these bad loans.
Obama's connections to this radical group began years ago when he first became a community organizer and caught the eye of Acorn head Madeline Talbot, who asked him to train her personal staff.
So all the up-and-coming leaders that Madeline Talbot was using as soldiers in her campaign against these banks, they were trained by Barack Obama. And on top of that, Barack Obama was channeling money toward Madeline Talbot and toward Acorn through his position at the Woods Fund and also in his position as chair of the board of directors at the Chicago Annenberg Challenge.
And Obama's support of Acorn went even further. In some of their early election law cases, Acorn's attorney was, well, you guessed it, Barack Obama.
He was their lawyer in a famous case in Illinois which upheld the constitutionality of the federal motor voter law, which prevented states from pruning their voter registration rolls to get rid of dead people, people who were not eligible, people who'd moved out of state.
If he truly thinks that Acorn is a reputable organization, why has Barack Obama glossed over the work that he did for them? Is he trying to distance himself from the radical group's methods of persuasion? Well, Obama may not have physically participated in their obvious scare tactics, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't involved.
Barack Obama helped to plan an operation where protesters would come and break into a meeting and surprise some businessmen who were sitting around a table and sort of surround them and just stand there silently. Then they all filed out. Well, they didn't do anything physical, but clearly they were intimidating this board of directors.
And what did Barack Obama get out of this cozy relationship with Acorn?
A lot of the Acorn organizers that he had helped to train ended up working for Obama in his first campaign and in his early campaigns as precinct organizers going to get out the vote. Now, that technically it would be illegal for Barack Obama to channel nonpartisan foundation money to Acorn and then have Acorn act as an election arm of Barack Obama's campaign.
The Illinois senator's connections to this radical group are still going strong. The Obama campaign recently paid more than $800,000 to the Citizen Services, Inc. Now, that's a subsidiary of Acorn for, quote, get out the vote projects. Now, up until then, Acorn has managed to fly below the radar, but their dangerous practices are coming back to haunt them and the rest of the country. The economic crisis facing the nation is due in large part to this disastrous decision by financial institutions Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy up risky loans from small banks. But it's groups like Acorn that force those banks to give out those loans in the first place.
Up to now, we've been looking at this whole process from the top down. We've been seeing the Wall Street connection, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac connection. But if you look from the ground up, that's where Acorn has been the driving force. And Barack Obama has been with them every step of the way.
It seems if the Illinois senator wants voters to believe that he has the answer to the nation's economic crisis, then he needs to distance himself from the group that he once represented.
I think understanding where Barack Obama is coming from would make any voter think twice about whether he's the right person to solve this problem.
Barack Obama says he wants to transcend partisan politics. Barack Obama says that he wants to reach out and work with people on the other side of the aisle. Barack Obama says he would be a moderate president. But his alliance with Acorn belies all of those statements. His alliance with Acorn indicates that some of his closest allies are radicals who want to dramatically change the American economy and push for higher taxes and bigger government.
Acorn, Ayers, Jeremiah Wright, Obama's list of friends reads like a history of radicalism.
Well, and there you have it. The entire story of Barack Obama and friends, the history of radicalism. Now, thank you for being with us tonight for this very special edition of Hannity's America. I'll see you tomorrow night for Hannity and Combs. And then on Tuesday, as Barack Obama and John McCain square off in their second presidential debate. You don't want to miss it. Thank you for being with us, and have a great rest of weekend.
It's endless shrimp at Red Lobster. Indulge in endless choices of your favorite shrimp, including new shrimp in a spicy Cajun butter sauce. It's endless shrimp, our best value of the year, now at Red Lobster.
You know you're a true Outback fan when you think a winning catch is our pecan crust.
And welcome to this special edition of Hannity's America, Obama and Friends, History of Radicalism, Volume 2. Now, tonight we are bringing you a revealing hour with more of Barack Obama's questionable relationships. Now, first on the rundown, we take a look at how Senator Barack Obama's campaign is trying to downplay his relationship with Bill Ayers and what they still refuse to tell you, the American people.
Barack Obama and domestic terrorist Bill Ayers. Friends. They've worked together for years, but Obama tries to hide it. Why?
He's a radical figure that Senator Barack Obama cannot seem to shake.
The question comes down to, he didn't know that he had launched his career in the living room of a domestic terrorist?
Bill Ayers continues to be a campaign issue despite the best efforts of the Obama campaign to sweep their relationship under the rug. Hannity's America led the way in exposing Senator Obama's controversial relationship to the founding member of the Weather Underground. The moment Senator Obama's relationship with Bill Ayers was exposed, the Obama campaign began issuing their standard denials. And that is that the senator didn't know him that well. Obama's campaign has downplayed the senator's link to Bill Ayers.
This is a guy who lives in my neighborhood, who's a professor of English in Chicago, who I know and who I have not received some official endorsement from. He's not somebody who I exchange ideas from on a regular basis.
But recently, Obama's association with the unrepentant terrorist is back in the spotlight and in the minds of the American voter. During a recent interview, Obama's chief strategist, David Axelrod, claimed that the senator was, quote, unaware of Ayers' violent past when he first met him at this house in Chicago. In the mid-1990s, Bill Ayers and his wife, Bernadine Dorn, hosted a meet and greet at their home during Obama's run for the Illinois Senate.
Well, I mean, when he went, he didn't know the history.
He didn't know? How is that even possible? Bill Ayers was not one to keep quiet about his past. David Horowitz is the author of Party of Defeat. Back in 1979, he interviewed Bill Ayers for over 10 hours for a piece that was published in Rolling Stone's magazine about the Weather Underground.
With all due respect to Barack Obama, when he says that Bill Ayers was just a neighbor and I didn't know about Bill Ayers, there is nobody around Bill Ayers who would not know this man's history, or Bernadine's. They all knew who Billy Ayers was. There is no way on earth that Barack Obama could be involved with them and not know who Billy and Bernadine were and what they did and what their agendas were. They hate America.
Does the Obama campaign still want to insist that Senator Barack Obama did not know about the Ayers background? Senator John McCain's campaign manager, Rick Davis, pressed David Axelrod on this issue on Fox News Sunday last week.
Do we not think that the relationship between Bill Ayers and Barack Obama bears some scrutiny? Because the press will not ask any questions about Barack Obama's background, it is a legitimate question. There are voters all over the country who say, we don't know enough about this man. The reason everybody's talking about Bill Ayers is your campaign and your candidate keeps changing the story on what the relationship is.
The Obama campaign is still refusing to give an answer to the question of when Obama first learned of Ayers' past. During a radio interview, the senator admitted he did in fact know of Ayers' history, but he didn't say when he found out.
Ultimately, I ended up learning about the fact that he had engaged in this reprehensible act 40 years ago. But I was 8 years old at the time, and I assumed that he had been rehabilitated.
It seems the Obama campaign needs to get the story straight. During an interview with Mark Halperin of Time magazine, Obama's communication director and senior spokesman, Robert Gibbs, was at a loss for words.
So you've not asked Senator Obama when he learned of his past?
I have not, but I don't know that he could tell you the exact date.
Well, but is it fair to say that he continued to associate with him professionally and personally on a casual basis even after he learned?
He continued to serve on a charitable board, and yes.
Right, but with the knowledge of Ayers' past.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, again, I don't know when Barack Obama found out. I don't know at what point. It's something I'll be more than happy to ask him.
To the best of our knowledge, there is no public record of Senator Obama condemning the actions of Bill Ayers until he was confronted about his association on the campaign trail.
Let's understand that each and every term, Barack Obama has condemned the deplorable actions that William Ayers did when Barack Obama was 8 years old.
Right.
So what is Gibbs talking about? Back in 1997, the Chicago Tribune published comments by Senator Obama on Bill Ayers' book, A Kind and Just Parent, The Children of the Juvenile Court. He said that it was, quote, a searing and timely account of the juvenile court system and the courageous individuals who rescue hope from despair. Funny, that doesn't quite sound like Senator Obama denouncing the unrepentant terrorist or even acknowledging that Bill Ayers was wrong for setting bombs at the Capitol, at the Pentagon, and at New York City Police Headquarters. And as we approach Election Day, Senator Obama's association with Bill Ayers continues to be an issue because he's not being completely honest with the American people. Now, during the last presidential debate, he was asked again to fully explain his radical relationship.
I don't care about an old washed-up terrorist, but as Senator Clinton said in her debates with you, we need to know the full extent of that relationship.
40 years ago, when I was 8 years old, he engaged in despicable acts with a radical domestic group. Mr. Ayers is not involved in my campaign. He has never been involved in this campaign.
You launched your political campaign in Mr. Ayers' living room.
That's absolutely not true.
As more information about Senator Barack Obama's association with Bill Ayers comes to light, it makes people wonder how much they still don't know about Senator Obama's radical associations.
Barack Obama's judgment and candor. When Obama just says, "This is a guy who lives in my neighborhood," Americans say, "Where's the truth, Barack?"
The unrepentant terrorist Bill Ayers says he didn't bomb enough. His defenders say that he tried not to hurt any people. But is that really true? You get to hear from some of his victims coming up. And then he is a convicted Chicago slumlord that helped launch Barack Obama's political career. But there is more to the story than some people want to admit. That's straight ahead.
Women are learning that as we age, it's harder to build bone density with calcium.
Senator Barack Obama's association with Bill Ayers is causing some people to question his judgment. Ayers says he didn't try to hurt anybody with his terrorist attacks, but that doesn't mean there weren't any victims.
What is that spirit that we want to connect to? That spirit of rebellion, the spirit of resistance, the spirit of insurgency.
We know Bill Ayers told the New York Times, quote, "I don't regret setting bombs." But does the unrepentant terrorist regret anything he did? Members of the Weather Underground claim the only people injured or killed as a result of their actions were 3 members of their own group who died in March of 1970 in a townhouse after a bomb exploded that they were building. Fox News Washington correspondent James Rosen interviewed Bill Ayers back in 2004 while conducting research for his book, The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate.
In my interview with him in 2004, William Ayers made the case that the Weather Underground were restrained in their actions because they didn't target people, they only targeted installations.
Is it your understanding that the only people who ever died as a result of any of these
WWU's activities were the 3 who died in the townhouse? Absolutely. Is that true? Absolutely. Okay. And no one else died, and that was both, you could say it was a happy chance, but it was also by design.
After losing 3 of his friends in the townhouse explosion, Bill Ayers and the weathermen explained that they tried to be cautious about not hurting people during their bombings.
We were very careful from the moment of the townhouse on to be sure we weren't going to hurt anybody, and we never did hurt anybody. Whenever we put a bomb in a public space, we had figured out all kinds of ways to put checks and balances on the thing, and also to get people away from it. And we were remarkably successful.
He thought he was, quote, remarkably successful? But what about all the weathermen's victims before the townhouse exploded, killing their friends? Are they somehow less important? David Horowitz is the author of Party of Defeat. Back in 1979, he interviewed Bill Ayers for over 10 hours for a piece that was published in Rolling Stone magazine about the Weather Underground.
I personally interviewed 30 leaders of the Weather Underground. I had spent 10 hours with Bill Ayers. I interviewed him in a kindergarten class or a preschool class where he was a teacher. The famous statement that Ayers made, in which he described himself as being guilty as hell, free as a bird, and then said, "America's a great country," that came from my interview.
We asked Bill Ayers' assertion that he and his terrorist friends never intended to hurt anyone.
Now, I interviewed Mark Rudd, and Mark Rudd, who was in the leadership, told me exactly what they did. They were making a bomb filled with nails. It was an anti-personnel bomb, and they intended to detonate it at a social dance at Fort Dix, New Jersey, that would be attended by 18-year-old draftees and their dates.
Are you still not convinced? Well, here are a couple of victims of the Weather Underground bombings that may just change your mind. Hannity's America interviewed John Murtaugh, a New York City councilman whose family's home was bombed on February 21st, 1970 by the Weather Underground. Murtaugh's father was a New York Supreme Court justice presiding over a Black Panther trial who were indicted in a plot to bomb New York City landmarks. The weathermen targeted the judge's home.
About 2 o'clock in the morning, our entire family, 4 of us, actually 5 of us, my sister, my brother, my parents, were awakened to 3 firebombs, carefully placed, 2 at the front entrance of the house, 1 by the back door underneath the tank of the family car.
Hannity's America also interviewed Paul Roganese, one of the NYPD officers injured in the Weather Underground bombing of the police headquarters at Center Street in New York in the early 1970s.
So I went outside, I went down a couple of floors or a floor to use the payphone to call my fiance, who is now my wife for 36 years. I don't remember anything else. She actually heard the boom.
Wow.
I never heard it.
Wow.
I remember waking up about 30 feet away on a staircase and just dust and debris and silence. I didn't hear anything. And then, I swear, I thought it was dead.
These victims tell the tale of the Weather Underground's very violent acts against America. After all, they were at war against the USA. But there is one man who infiltrated the group and knew of their terrorist acts firsthand. Larry Grathwohl is a former FBI agent who went undercover and became a member of the Weather Underground.
You were there with Bill Ayers and sat at a kitchen table, and he specifically not only taught you how to build a bomb, but actually drew pictures of it and actually told you what cities to target, correct?
Yes, when we were in Detroit, 2 targets were picked out, the Detroit Police Officers Association building in the 13th precinct. There was some kind of a trial going on involving police officers. And he told us what buildings we should bomb. He assigned the people to the various locations. And when I objected, because the DPOA building was next door to a restaurant, and then it was my belief that the bomb would kill more people in the restaurant than anyone in this old brownstone building in Detroit, he told me that in a revolution, innocent people have to die.
Maybe Bill Ayers did not think his victims would ever come forward. But the big question is, how can Senator Barack Obama think it's okay to serve on a board, blurb a book, give speeches with, and associate with a man who is not sorry about his terrorist past?
Ayers also continued to harbor, 3 years after 9/11, thoughts about the United States and its government that were far out of the mainstream of American society. Ayers told me in 2004 that he considered that the United States was responsible for many, many acts that were, as he put it, comparable to 9/11.
He hates America. That's why you have the photograph of him standing on the flag. He has always hated America. He continues to hate America. And in his 10 or 12-year working association with Barack Obama, he has hated America.
And coming up, convicted felon Tony Resco not only helped finance Obama's political career, but was reportedly behind the deal that landed Obama in his current home. Those details coming up next. And also, one of Barack Obama's first radical relationships dates back to his teenage years. It's a story you probably have not heard, and you won't believe how far people have gone to conceal it. That's next. We have reported on a laundry list of radical and questionable people associated with Barack Obama, but one man that we haven't talked about is Tony Resco.